Welcome to the lesson on line weights, and in this lesson we're going to learn and understand more about why we need to line weight, why we should line weight, what line weights are, and where line weighting comes from, the concept of line weighting. So the first thing that I want to teach you about is something called atmospheric perspective. All right, and the concept is pretty straightforward. Basically, in the real world, air builds up between two objects, right? So there's just like a bunch of air between the two objects. And this happens to varying degrees. Obviously, when things are very close to us, there is air there, but the buildup is not much. And the further back things go, things tend to build up a little bit more. And when the air builds up, it tends to lighten the values, that is the brightness and the darkness of the object as it goes further back in the distance. And you see this when you're looking, out on top of, when you're standing on top of a mountain, you're looking out on a city, and you see, that the further back things go, you can kind of see that atmosphere, you can kind of see that air, and that perception of that air buildup helps you gauge the distance back that those objects are, because the further back they go, the lighter they get, and conversely, the closer things come to us, the darker they get, right? The more contrasting they get, and you could also say the more detailed they get, because they're kind of not being blurred out by the air in between the objects. All right, so in a nutshell, that is atmospheric perspective. Let's call this one close, this one far, and then just to kind of push the point, the far object would be somewhat lighter. All right, so the air kind of builds up. And that is what atmospheric perspective is. I see I forgot the C here. I'm just going to pop that in there. Right, atmospheric perspective. Closer objects are darker, further away objects are lighter, and we're going to use atmospheric perspective to inform how we come to understand line weighting, right? So line weighting isn't just something that we want to use in an inking stage. We want to try and implement line weighting all the time. So let's talk about line weights. Okay. Line weights or line weighting, right? So far we've learned about a few techniques for achieving a 3D look, right? And one of those techniques is drawing through, right? We want to draw through objects. We want to kind of imagine the other side of them. And the other technique that we've learned is overlapping lines, right? So even in 3D shapes or 2D shapes, when we start overlapping lines, we can achieve a sense of depth. And what line weighting does in many respects is it enhances the overlaps and introduces atmospheric perspective into the piece. So line weights really are degrees of weighting of the lines. So thicker lines come forward and thinner lines recede. Okay, so thicker lines come forward and thinner lines recede back into the distance. Pretty straightforward concept, I think, right? And so when we're drawing something in the foreground and we have an object in the background, what we can do, apart from the overlaps, apart from drawing through the forms to help us imagine the forms and the structures, is that we can weight the lines where they overlap on the foreground object, make them thicker, make them darker, to reinforce that this object is in front of the object behind it. What we can do is we can even darken just slightly the origin of the background points line to kind of hint at a little bit of a shadow that's happening there from the overlap. Okay. So the basic rule really is that if an object's in front, it should have slightly thicker lines than the object behind it. So for example, an arm crossing over a chest, even in a rough view like this, here's the arm crossing over the chest. This arm would be thicker lined and have a thicker weighting to it in general than the lines that it's covering. For example, there are some shirt lines here would be lighter, etc. Now another tip for this as well is to keep inner details for the smaller shapes, the details, things like shirts and buttons and creases and folds and things, inner details, usually keep them at thinner lines and keep the bigger shapes, the bigger forms, having thicker, darker lines. But nevertheless, the fundamentals of line weights really are that foreground objects have darker, thicker lines and background objects have thinner, lighter lines. Now, I don't only just have this theory for you, I want to show you an example. This is an orc piece that I've done. And here you can see a multitude of varying line weights in the piece. Okay. So let me get a red pencil here and let's kind of deep dive the line weights a little bit. So here we can see inner details, like those little tattoo marks, the little hairs on his chin, and the muscular lines of the sternocleidomastoids there. And many inner details have quite thin lines and also quite light lines, right? And then the bigger objects, such as his head, for example, which is overlapping his neck, you can see that there is a thicker line weighting applied just in general as these elements overlap, right? Overlap the objects behind them. Thinner lines in the background elements, thicker lines in the foreground elements. Another point as well is that foreground objects generally being darker means you can use darker lines in the foreground objects, and you can press lightly on your pencil to get thinner and lighter lines in the background objects. So here you can see how even though this line is thin over here, it kind of tapers off and goes pretty light as it comes to the edge here. I mean, that's not a general rule that things get lighter as they go right, but I'm just acknowledging that there is a kind of a more lightness here. And that's basically also really just implying detail to the viewer. This isn't a main focal point of the piece. Just let it be light, let it be thin. It's a little bit loose, but it's okay. And here, as we have the hand coming into the foreground, that's holding the sword over here, that the line weight is emphasized as we move around this particular form, right? And so its whole edge is kind of made thicker and made darker to help the viewer realize and understand that this is in front and the other objects are behind, to add depth. Line weighting also adds a very nice sense of character to the piece. It makes the piece look quite professional, makes the piece look quite slick. And so you want to always be trying to engineer line weights, stacking the theories on top of each other, stacking form with line overlaps, so drawing through, making sure you've got line overlaps, and then making sure your line weights are reading, that foreground objects have thicker lines, that background objects have thinner lines, and then remembering always also to draw loosely so that you get these nice tapers at the ends of your lines and that lines are looking natural and they have directionality to them. All right, that is the end of the lesson on line weights.